We begin today, August 21st, with breaking news from New York, where an appeals court has delivered a significant legal victory to President Donald Trump. The court has thrown out the nearly $500 million civil penalty imposed on him in his business fraud case. The decision stems from an appeal heard last year, where the court had already expressed skepticism about the massive disgorgement order. In a concurring opinion, Justice Peter Moulton was explicit, stating that the lower court's order directing the payment of almost $500 million to the state of New York constitutes an excessive fine, which is a violation of the Eighth Amendment of the United States Constitution. This amendment famously prohibits cruel and unusual punishments, but also excessive fines and bail. The original ruling had found Trump and his company liable for fraudulently inflating the value of their assets to secure more favorable loan and insurance terms. The penalty was intended to represent the ill-gotten gains from these practices. However, the appellate judges have now nullified that penalty, sending a clear message about the constitutional limits on financial punishments, even in civil cases. This development is a major reversal in one of the most high-profile legal battles facing the president and his business empire. The case will now likely be subject to further legal proceedings to determine the next steps, but for now, the staggering financial penalty has been wiped away. This story is still developing, and we will bring you more details as they become available. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Trump is taking direct action on another front: crime in the nation's capital. Later today, the president is scheduled to personally conduct a patrol of the city's streets alongside members of the Metropolitan Police and the National Guard. This unusual move follows his administration's recent efforts to federalize the D.C. Police Department and deploy military support to address what he has described as an unacceptable level of crime. The initiative began on August 11th, when the president first mobilized 800 members of the D.C. National Guard. Since then, the operation has expanded significantly, drawing in additional Guard troops from as far away as Ohio, West Virginia, South Carolina, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee. The plan to federalize the Metropolitan Police Department effectively places the city's local law enforcement under direct federal command, a measure rarely seen and one that raises complex questions about local governance and federal oversight. In an interview with radio host Todd Starnes earlier today, the president confirmed his participation, stating, "I'm going to be going out tonight with the police and with the military, of course." The administration's stated goal is to create a strong, visible presence to deter criminal activity and restore order. This hands-on approach by a sitting president is unprecedented in modern times and is being closely watched by civil liberties groups and proponents of local control. The president's assertion of federal authority in Washington is mirrored by another bold move, targeting the nation's electoral system. The Trump administration is now seeking to eliminate mail-in ballots and electronic voting machines, pushing for a return to all-paper, in-person voting. President Trump has been vocal in his criticism of current methods, telling reporters just this week during a meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that mail-in ballots are corrupt. Following these remarks, he announced that his legal team is in the process of drafting an executive order to mandate this sweeping change. Such a move would fundamentally alter how millions of Americans cast their votes and is certain to ignite a firestorm of legal challenges. States like Oregon, Washington, and Hawaii, which conduct their elections almost entirely by mail, would be at the forefront of any opposition. Legal experts are already weighing in, noting that an executive order of this nature pushes the very limits of presidential constitutional authority. Election law is traditionally the purview of the states, and any federal changes of this magnitude would likely require an act of Congress rather than a unilateral directive from the White House. The debate centers on whether the federal government can impose a single voting standard on all 50 states, overriding their established and varied procedures. The administration's push for this change sets the stage for a major constitutional confrontation over the mechanics of American democracy. This tension between federal directives and state autonomy is a recurring theme for the administration, extending well beyond election law. A prime example is the ongoing legal battle over so-called sanctuary jurisdictions. The Department of Justice has filed lawsuits against multiple states and localities for policies that limit their cooperation with federal immigration enforcement. The administration argues that these sanctuary policies, which often prohibit local law enforcement from inquiring about immigration status or holding individuals for ICE, violate federal law and the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. This clause establishes that federal law generally takes precedence over state law. However, the states and cities being sued are pushing back with their own constitutional argument. They contend that the 10th Amendment prevents the federal government from commandeering state resources. In other words, forcing them to use their own personnel and funds to enforce federal laws. President Trump has also threatened to defund these jurisdictions, but that effort has been stalled by numerous lawsuits. These cases are now working their way through the federal courts, testing the delicate balance of power between Washington and state governments. Finally, the administration's assertive policy approach is also sending ripples through the financial markets. Shares of major semiconductor companies fell sharply yesterday and continue to be under pressure today. The sell-off was triggered by reports that the White House is considering taking equity stakes in chip makers in exchange for grants from the CHIPS and Science Act. This landmark legislation was designed to bolster domestic manufacturing of essential microchips and reduce reliance on foreign supply chains. Now, according to a Reuters report citing a White House official, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick is developing a plan where the government would become a shareholder in companies receiving federal funds. While the secretary had previously confirmed such a plan for Intel, the new reports suggest it could extend to other major recipients, including Micron, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, and Samsung. The market reacted swiftly to the news. Intel's stock dropped a steep 7%, while Micron shares fell by 4%, and TSMC slid nearly 2%. Other industry giants like Nvidia and AMD also saw their shares decline. The potential for the government to take ownership stakes, even non-controlling ones, has introduced a new layer of uncertainty for investors. The size of these potential stakes has not been determined, but the very prospect is reshaping the financial calculations for companies that were banking on federal support to expand their U.S. operations.